voices that voters ought to be able to have, probably in a way that hasn't been considered before. Normally when people have looked at constitutional changes, it's been this assumption that blocks of voters largely fall between two competing pools of parties, and normally just two, and that the power will sway from one side to the other over time, and that even though the occasional election might have some sort of inconsistency, overall it averages out evenly between two sides of politics. And I think what's interesting now is that people are rejecting that and saying that actually these binary choices in politics are unlike any sort of other choice that we have in our lives. So in a way, it's democracy in politics and the Constitution catching up with the way people are already behaving in every other aspect of their life. And I think that's very encouraging for the campaigns that we're trying to win here. I just want to quickly run through the questions that have been posed. The Electoral Reform Society in the UK has been going for quite a long time. It was formed in 1884, so we've been going for 132 years trying to reform the electoral system at Westminster for elections to the House of Commons. That possibly makes us the most patient people in the world, but it also, I think, more importantly shows just how committed electoral reformers are and have been pointing out for so long the inability of a binary two-party system to cope with the pluralistic views of citizens whose choices in fact go across many parties, and of course also sometimes no parties. And we all know the difficulties that independent political identities have getting elected under these electoral systems. First part of the post, as Tanya mentioned, is an export from the UK to many Commonwealth countries. So we've come all the way across the Atlantic to apologise for this. But it's so great how many countries, states and provinces are trying to move away from it. That's Kelly powering up. It's great to see how many places are now taking that fight quite seriously. There are increasingly, this is making the House of Commons at Westminster look very isolated, and we hope that with the work that's going on here in Canada, the House of Commons in Ottawa will look just as isolated using first past the post. We work across three of the nations of the UK. We have offices in Edinburgh, Wales, Edinburgh, Cardiff and London. And our London office takes a UK-wide perspective. We focus very much on the Westminster Parliament, the House of Commons, but there's been a phenomenal shift in power across the UK in the last 15 years, and legislatures in Belfast, Cardiff and Edinburgh are now taking on increasing responsibilities and powers, and so we think it's important that we're in there helping to shape the democratic culture that develops in those countries. We have both paid members, people who pay us to belong to the Electoral Reform Society, and we have supporters, people who will be involved in some of our digital campaigns, who follow our work online, and who try and promote the cause that we are trying to promote. The situation in the UK kind of brilliantly explained just why First isn't working anymore. There are just too many millions of voters whose votes don't count for anything. There are people who live in safe seats, some of which there are 650 seats in the United Kingdom Parliament, so a lot of MPs, and there are some seats that haven't changed hands since Queen Victoria was on the throne. So really, if you are not from the dominant party in that community, then you can literally live your entire life and your children's, grandchildren's lives without ever having your vote cast or vote counted, and we're trying to really draw attention to that. The last general election was probably the most interesting because there were so many anomalies that made people for the first time remember how unfair it was. And most importantly, I think from our point of view, it was on the left and the right of the political spectrum. When I come to talk about some of the challenges I think the movement for electoral reform faces, it is very much perceived as being on one side of the ideological spectrum. And the blunt truth is that most of the people who work on trying to achieve reform tend to be on one side of the ideological spectrum. And one of the challenges is to try and take it outside of that party-specific viewpoint and see that this is about democracy for all citizens over dozens and dozens of elections, not trying to see how your particular party would have done at the last election and what the system we're talking about right now means for your particular party at the next election. What we're talking about is a vision much broader than just that quite narrow way of looking at it. But there were parties that received many millions of votes and got woeful representation. And I think what was very interesting about it is that the third largest party in the UK saw its support more or less completely collapse. And rather than all of that vote just kind of naturally going back to the old way of doing things, to the two big parties back in the 1950s when the two major parties secured 98% of the vote, those voters who were no longer supporting that third largest party spread their wings across additional parties. So I don't think citizens are going back into that old way of doing politics, even though the two major parties would absolutely love it if they did that. The campaigns that we're working on at the moment are, of course, House of Commons reform, also local government reform, as that takes on more power in the UK. We don't want there to be first past the post electing those increasingly powerful authorities, but also House of Lords reform. The House of Lords, the second chamber, is completely unelected, apart from one anomaly with hereditary peers, but by and large, these are all political appointments and bishops of the Church of England who sit in the House of Lords, and there's over 800 members of it. Only China has a larger second chamber than the UK, and the last time I checked, the population in China was slightly higher than that of the UK, so there's no great justification to having the world's second largest chamber, but that is unelected, unaccountable power, people appointed for life because of their political patronage. We're bringing a lot of attention to that, to votes at 16, and to other topics as well, party funding, women's representation, etc. So we're bringing a very broad canvas, but we're also wanting to make sure we don't lose that desire to get rid of first past the post. The challenges in working towards reform are huge. You know, we all sit here and agree on the need for it, but there's no doubt that achieving it is very, very difficult. In countries where citizens don't have the vote, it's quite easy to organise a rebellion or a protest or an ability to rise up against the system. What we're talking about here is counting existing votes in a different way, which isn't quite the call to arms for people who don't have a vote at all. And so that's why we have to be very thoughtful about how it is that we pursue this reform. As was mentioned, I think by Anthony, there are many, and Kyla mentioned with opinion polling as well, there are many people who agree with us on this, but it is nowhere near their defining issue or their number one political view, and no amount of well-meaning language from us, or figures, or statistics, or great explanations of the beautiful design of the latest electoral system we've thought out. None of these things are going to elevate that. We need to work out a path within the political system of trying to change that. And I think for us 5 years ago, with the defeat in a nationwide referendum on a very minor change from first past the post to alternative vote, really showed the struggle of trying to build up popular support for this. And I wanted to mention that, not to relitigate the arguments as to why that was, but to point out that it's not just about us trying to persuade people. There are people who oppose electoral reform, even the most modest electoral reforms, who oppose it so strongly that they will throw everything in their opposition to it. And we need to be, as people who are wanting to get reform, not only thinking about how to organise our own arguments, but actually thinking about what we do with the full force of people who want the status quo come after you. And I want to pick up on the two references to referendums, having just been through the Brexit vote in the UK, where there is, I think even the most staunch Leave advocate would acknowledge that there were many things said that turned out not to be correct or true or sustainable through the campaign, that referendums can often be made to look as though they're great democratic devices, but actually by the time the day of the vote arrives, the debate is way far away from what it was on the day that referendum was called. And actually there's a lot of vulnerability in that as a tool if you're trying to get a genuine decision made about how votes should be cast. So I think that is a challenge towards reform. I also think that in terms of who we're trying to target now, Kyla mentioned the Labour Party, and there's a lot of change in the opposition, major opposition UK party. if you don't get that, even with this shift of voting, 2/3 of people are still voting for these two large parties. And that's a club that's pretty significant. And that's a club that knows that if everything stays the same, power sort of trades over time between both sides, and there's a level of comfort about that from those two parties. So really what we need is to get a significant enough force within one of the parties, maybe not the whole party, but a significant enough number to break their position on that, so that we can achieve change through having allies in the major parties. In the UK, from the UK perspective, one of the really encouraging thing in the last year or so has been a big shift in the trade union movement, which was not supporters of electoral reform. In fact, most of them even opposed this modest little change to AV, which isn't even a proportional system, as you know. So bringing on board those new allies is a very important, we think, part of the jigsaw puzzle for achieving change within the Labour Party. Finally, just in terms of some examples of successful actions, not all is lost on this. Since the election of Tony Blair in 1987, there's been this massive shift of power outside of Westminster. So we've returned to having a directly elected Mayor of London, which didn't exist before. The Scottish Parliament was returned after a 300-year absence. A Welsh Assembly was established, Northern Ireland Assembly. And what's really interesting from a democratic reform point of view is that even a first-past-the-post majority government of Westminster, whenever it's set up new institutions and given away power, has always used some form of PR rather than imposing first-past-the-post. So in Scotland, for example, MNP is used to elect the Scottish Parliament as it's used to elect the Welsh Assembly. Scotland also uses STV for the local elections, but it's forced to use first-past-the-post for Westminster. And in Northern Ireland, they use STV for everything apart from Westminster elections, where they use first-past-the-post. So we're starting to build up really nice examples of what that means for the same citizens in Scotland who get to vote for proportional representation and have every vote counts for the institutions closest to them, their local council, their Scottish Parliament, but then sees a completely distorted picture at Westminster. And to give just a closing example of that meant that in the last general election last year, the Scottish National Party received half the vote, which is a significant achievement. Full congratulations to them in a multi-party setting. To get half the vote is incredible, but they took 95% of the seats, leaving just the other 3 remaining seats to the parties that received the other half of the vote. So there's a lot of good examples, a lot of good evidence, a lot of developing trends of real lived examples of PR that we can point to. But I think what I would say is that our challenges are huge because we assume a level of detail by the public that's never going to exist. We can't help ourselves but to, having learned about one electoral system, rush off and design another one to impress each other with. And we face opponents on this who are so well resourced and who will say anything that our very nice, worthy approaches can be steamrolled over if we're not as well organised and as well prepared to be able to dig in on this. But having said all that, the reason we were, I think, speaking for Klein and I, the reason we were so keen to come is that we would just love to see Canada move to PR to be the next one of the dominoes of the first-past-the-post project that falls, and be able to do that by representative democracy, by your elected MPs honouring the manifesto pledge they made at the last general election. So we're keen to help in any way we can, because we think that what happens here will help citizens in the UK as well. Thank you very much.